as I've been discussing earlier, I was talking about strategies and procedures. Of course, not only Vinay and Arbanet has got this, but also there are other scholars who have actually been looking into this as well. Like, for example, Peter Newmark. Peter Newmark also talked about translation procedures, but also talked about strategies, but strategies is something completely different. Like faithful translation, he calls it strategies. He talks about it in a different way, let's say. There are lots of, and one of these strategies where he calls them faithful translation, for example, as being one of the strategies. But I'm going to talk about only today, only the procedures with regards to, with regards to Newmark. Now, Newmark, in 1988, he actually mentioned 17 procedures. And these procedures start with transference, which is loan words or transcription. Sometimes it's called transliteration, which is a process of transferring an S.r.l word to a T.l text as a translation procedure. It is the same as Catford's transference. Catford talks about it as well in the 60s, and it includes also transliteration as well. Now, naturalness is the second procedure, what he is talking about. And naturalness means the natural pronunciation in the TL that's written in the TL2, which is like computer, demokratiya, Tony, fatura. Some other scholars call it Arabicization or Arabization, which is applying the TL grammar on foreign words. The next procedure, which is cultural equivalence. And cultural equivalence, it's approximation kind of translation where an S.r.l cultural word is translated by a T.l cultural word. Baccalaureate, for example, is translated as in the French A level. In English they call it A level, and in French they call it baccalaureate. And of course in Arabic you can call it ثانوية عامة. Then we move on to the functional equivalence, and I'm going to give you some examples at the very end of this session for some of these procedures, so that it will be really imprinted in your heads, and then you can actually then remember them better and understand them better with examples. Because usually without examples, many are going to be confused and not know how to use them. These procedures. And procedures means specific to a certain expression. Strategy means it's a very general one. Applies to a general, the whole text is a strategy you are applying. Whether it's you're using direct translation or faithful translation or free translation or dynamic translation, like functional translation, that's another thing, but it's a strategy. Now here, functional equivalence is a procedure which is commonly used to the cultural words, where you are actually producing a cultural free word sometimes with a specific term. Example, for example, the word baccalaureate, if you translate it as French secondary school leaving exam, then that is functional equivalence. يعني بدل ما نترجم بكالوريا بنقول ثانوية عامة بالفرنسية أو امتحان الثانوية العامة. أو مثلا we say Duma or we say Sejm, البرلمان the Polish parliament, or Duma, which is the Russian parliament, or Shura Council, which is the Saudi parliament, or Council, which is الكويتي parliament. And here of course السرايا الحكومي باللبناني أو البرلمان they call it, or مجلس الشعب is also known in some countries like in Egypt, in Syria, and مجلس الأمة في الكويت, مجلس الشورى. And then you've got Pentagon, if you translate Pentagon as وزارة الدفاع في الولايات المتحدة. Also Home Office, if you translate it as وزارة الداخلية. MI5 as المخابرات الداخلية. And Foreign Secretary as وزير الخارجية in UK, whereas in America they call it Secretary of State, which is وزير الخارجية. So you have to be careful on the way it is used when it is used, American English or British English. Then we have descriptive equivalence, which is like looking at the word and how do you describe it, for example. Like machete, which is satur, is translated into a Latin American broad and heavy instrument. يعني أداة ثقيلة عريضة تستخدم في أمريكا اللاتينية مثلا. Or it's translated as being أداة قطع أو أداة عدائية. That is a descriptive equivalence when you are trying to do that. Here it is more of a definition of the word or the phrase. Then we move off to synonymy. And in synonymy you have using the same word that has this close sense in the target language, you know, where a precise equivalent may or may not exist. For example, types of snow in Eskimo country, in an Eskimo country, can be similar to the types of sand in the desert. So you can translate it like, instead of saying types of snow, you can say it's types of sand, because it's well known in the desert, types of sands. Maybe some cultures may not have it. So you're trying to find something that may not exist in the target language, and you're trying to find an equivalent, which can be called also adaptation in a way. Then we move on, according to Newmark, to number 7, which is a procedure called through translation, which is the literal translation of common collocation, names of organizations or components of compounds like Superman, or perhaps phrases like compliment de la saison, which means compliments of the season. It is known as calque in Vinay and Darbilnet, or loan translation. And here it's a word-for-word translation of collocations. Next one is shifts or transpositions, as it's known as well in some other by other scholars, which is change in the grammar from S.l to T.l. A second type of shift is required when an S.l grammar structure does not exist in the T.l. Basically, you are changing the structure in the T.l. So a structure in the S.l which does not exist in the T.l. So shift in structure from formal sentence to a verbal sentence or clause, from a phrase to a clause if need be, from active to passive or vice versa, from double negation, it's not easy, you say it's difficult, being translated into a positive sentence. Not likely is translated as likely, or word class, you're changing from noun to an adjective or a noun to a verb. Then you have modulation, which is where Vinay and Darbilnet talks about modulation as well, which is like it's just a change of point of view when you are looking at words like Chateau d'eau, which means water tower in French. It's in English in water tower. And when you look at it in bilingual dictionaries, this is what you find. Or you can go for, which is like a free modulation really here happening here. There are many other examples, change of view, like Mary bought the car from John. You can translate it as John sold the car to Mary. يعني إما اشترت ماري السيارة من جون أو باع جون السيارة لماري. أو مثال آخر, another example, he married her or she is married to him. تزوجها أو هي تزوجته. Then number 10 in these procedures is recognized translation, where you should normally use the official and the generally accepted translation of any institutional term. Like, for example, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which can be translated الوكالة الدولية للطاقة الذرية. We cannot translate it as وكالة الطاقة الذرية الدولية. We cannot do that. That will be not following the recognized translation. Then we have translation label principles, which is the provisional translation. Here there is no such translation of the institutional term, which is a new one, so you put it in inverted commas because it's not well known yet, and you are discreetly withdrawing it, which can be withdrawn at any time discreetly. It can be done through literal translation. Example, manipulation in translation can be translated as المعالجة في الترجمة. Of course, you can put المعالجة between inverted commas, or you can say الاستمالة في الترجمة, also inverted commas. But then you cannot say تلاعب في الترجمة. خاصة there is especially there is a school called manipulation in translation studies. Manipulation school, well known. You can't say مدرسة التلاعب في الترجمة. لأن كلمة تلاعب يعني it's a pejorative, which means that it is actually not, it's sarcastic or cynical. But that's not what it's meant. This is a well-known actual school in translation studies, and this school, by the way, is really well established. So you can't really say تلاعب مدرسة التلاعب في الترجمة, because it will actually sound very negative when it is not negative at all. They are trying to actually see if they can actually make the translation a little bit more acceptable in the target language, as it were, but without having this kind of deceptive element when you say تلاعب. تلاعب means playing up with, or trying to change it intentionally in such a very obnoxious way, and it's not the case. So you can't say تلاعب, you say المعالجة. Then, for example, you have, for example, words like مثلا Kamal Abu Deeb. I have seen his translation at one time for the word gender. He translated it as al-junusa instead of avoiding the word jins, because jins can be confused with the word sex here in Arabic. And there's genre, which can be translated as naw'un-nas. Okay? But then there is also a type, as in text type, which can be called naw'un-nas. So then the next procedure is called compensation, where this is said to occur when loss of meaning is happening, or sound effect, or metaphor, or pragmatic effect in one part of the sentence is compensated in another part or in the text, in a contiguous sentence. For example, يعني كلمة أو جملة مجاورة تشرح فيها بعض الأمور المتعلقة في هذا الexample. Then this example or this term. So you are compensating by adding a phrase or a clause in this way. So when there is a loss of meaning due to translating the word, but still some of the meaning is missing, so it is compensated in a clause later on or earlier on in the text. Number 13, and there are only 17, which means another 4 left, there's what's called componential analysis in the translation, where you are translating the term by splitting lexical units, or the lexical unit, which is the word, into its sense components, such as to rebuild. And you break it down. To re means يعيد, and build يبني. So يعيد بنا. And then number 14 is reduction or expansion, where you either reduce the translation, make it shorter, or you expand the translation, make it longer. And these are imprecise translation procedures, which you practice intuitively in some cases, but ad hoc in another, according to Newmark on page 90. So you either reduce the meaning of the S.r.l. in the TT, or expand the meaning of the S.r.l. in the TT. Number 15 is paraphrase, which means you amplify or you explain the meaning of a segment of the text, and it is used in an anonymous text when it is poorly written or has important implications or omissions. Number 16, before the last, which is couplets and triplets or quadruplets, and that is when you use more than one procedure at the same time in the same term. So you can use, for example, here, you can use more than one, i.e. you can use, let's say, transposition with another procedure. So you're combining 2 procedures at the same time, and that's called couplets, or you can combine 3 procedures or 4 procedures or 5, it depends on that term in order to make it easier. So you can use calc and mix it with some notes perhaps, and other procedures as well. So you're combining quite a few. This is in this procedure here. And in the last example here, or the last procedure, according to Newmark, is notes and additions and glosses. Glosses, you add information in between brackets. For example, meaning here is use, what is meant by this procedure is that you are using footnotes or endnotes, or you're trying, in other words, you are trying to explain a point that's being made by using these notes and adding them. Like the word falafel, for example, you are translating it as chickpeas mashed and fried dish. A chickpeas, it's a fried dish which has got chickpeas in it, and they are mashed before they are fried. Or abaya, which is a garment worn by men and women in some countries, Arab countries, but in other countries it's only worn by women, for example. So you are explaining abaya, and that's what's called gloss. You're glossed translation or addition you can add to it. Now, let's have some examples here. For example, this is a functional equivalence. When the soldiers left Hadiya, the village was in shambles. Here, عندما غادر الجنود الهادية، يعني قرية اسمها الهادية، بعد أن خلطوا زيتها بطحينها. The village was in shambles. That's a functional translation, functional equivalence. Here is another one. Such a well brought up girl, and look what she ended up with. أصيلة وأخذت قديش. يعني she has married somebody who is stupid or a mule. You can take our money but don't touch our progeny. فشعار حياتهم في المال ولا في العيال. This is a functional equivalence. There is also religious equivalence, for example, Insha'Allah, Wahidullah, Rahimahullah, for example, which are religious culture, related to religious culture. Cultural equivalent, like Astaghfirullah, maybe can be God forbid. That's what you can do that. Stay for lunch, sorry, here we got the word stay, which is wrongly here written, it should not be there. But stay for lunch, and then you can be on your way with our prayers for God's protection. تغدوا والله يسهل عليكم. You see, this is a kind of cultural equivalence here. Prayers for God's protection, which is in English, well known as a cultural equivalence. Another example of cultural equivalence, for example here, حان وقت الأذان, look at how it's translated. It was time for a mid-afternoon call for prayer. In the English, in the Arabic, it didn't say mid-afternoon, but you see here the translators added a little bit, describing, and so it's a description as well as a functional kind of translation, equivalence. وَلْتَسْمَحُوا لِي بِأَنْ أَكُونَ إِمَامَكُمْ. With your permission, I'll be the prayer leader. And here you are using a functional equivalence. Here is another example of functional equivalence. If she isn't more beautiful than both the sun and the moon, I will divorce her. علي الطلاء إنها أحلى من الشمس وأحلى من القمر. This is a functional kind of translation here. And lastly, كل خطيب يبالغ في محاولته كي يرى عروس المستقبل, which is a kind of paraphrase and expansion here. Overly enthusiastic fiancés who went overboard in their attempts to see their bride-to-be. Of course, the word went overboard is an addition or an expansion here, and that is another procedure which is being used here. So as we have seen here, that these kind of procedures that are used by Newmark some of them are similar, because Newmark has taken from Vinay and Darbinet as well, some of them, like modulation, transposition and shifts. So let me just sort of remind you, or maybe we'll go together very quickly with some of these, like transference, which is transcription, or transliteration. That is what's transference, and Catford has used it as well to mean that. Then naturalness, which is like when you say Tony to Tony, democracy, demokratiya, computer, Arabicization sometimes called. Procedure, also cultural equivalence, we've seen some of them, like baccalaureate is translated as A-level. Functional equivalence, like translating baccalaureate as secondary school certificate, and Duma is translated into parliament. And then, or you have Majlis al-Shab, Majlis al-Ummah is translated as parliament. That's functional translation. Wazarat al-Difa, Pentagon, and the Home Office, Wazarat al-Dakhliya, and so on. Then descriptive equivalence, so there you have the word mashati or mashat, which is satur. You can translate it as أداة كبيرة وممكن تستخدم فيها descriptive, which is like a definition of the word, is more like as being translated by using the definition. Or synonymy, you can use a synonym for it, or near synonym. It may not exist in the target language, that's the thing. Like types of snow, maybe you can say types of sand, because nobody will understand the types of snow when you're translating different types. Maybe you can say that it's similar to types of sands. There's also through translation, which is like calc, as said by, or loan translation, and then which is word for word. Then there are the shifts or transpositions, and we have come across them. It is not unlikely, which is it is likely, a noun for the verb. And then modulation, which is used also by Darbelnet, and we've looked at them, some of them, like the point of view, John married her and she is married to him, and that's modulation. Then recognized translation, where you look at the official translation of certain terms of institutions, IAEA or the UNICEF. It has got a specific translation in Arabic, and IAEA الوكالة الدولية الطاقة الذرية, and not وكالة الطاقة الذرية الدولية. You can't do that. That is because there is an official translation of this term. So it's better to actually be using the official translation. Then there is translation labels, where you actually use, like for manipulation in translation, and you say, because you put it in inverted commas because it's new, it's not yet approved, but you are trying to sort of, as it were, you're trying to put as best as you know, based on your experience. It's like a similar, it's a kind of judgment, because you are expert. It can be called ijtihad to an extent. It's kind of like you are working hard and you are giving a judgment based on your knowledge. So you can say istimala or al-mu'alaja for manipulation in translation, and then gender, of course, and there's genre. Compensation, when you are trying to compensate for any loss in the translation by contiguous sentences before or after. Then componential analysis, when you are breaking down the word. I mean, this is usually what happens when you are talking about